When the body is still and the mind is silent, the soul activates its light vehicle, the Merkaba, and journeys beyond the illusion of separation. Dr. Drunvalo Melchizedek. For thousands of years, this was not a line in a book. It was a lived truth, a way of moving through existence, not with your feet, but with your being. The ancients did not see life as a straight road. They saw it as a spiral, a pattern of return and expansion, where each breath could be a doorway, and each heartbeat could be the drum that carried you between worlds. Today, in our restless age, we race toward destinations that never seem to arrive. We treat stillness like a waste of time, and silence like an empty room we're afraid to enter. But in the old world, the one before clocks and skyscrapers, stillness was the beginning of everything. They called it many names. In ancient Egypt, it was the Merkaba. Light, not the kind from a lamp, but the living light used in ascension temples, moving as a rotating fields of pure energy. Ka, spirit, the personal essence, the signature of your life force that could not be duplicated. Ba, body, both the flesh you inhabit now and the ethereal form you carry after death. To speak this name was to remember that you are not just a body, not just a soul, but a living intersection of the two, carried by light itself. When the priests of old taught the Merkaba, they didn't begin with geometry. They began with breath. Because geometry may shape the vessel, but breath is what fills it with life. One inhale, one exhale, a quiet mind, a still body. And suddenly, the room is not just a room anymore. You feel the edges of yourself dissolve. You are wider than the walls. You are brighter than the light filtering in. And somewhere deep within, you remember a movement you've made before, but not in this lifetime. The first door to the Merkaba does not open in stone temples, nor in far-off mountains. It opens here, in the stillness you carry with you everywhere, in the pause between thoughts, in the space between heartbeats. It opens when you realize that silence is not empty. Silence is full of signals, of memory, of the subtle hum of life itself. The ancients believed this stillness was not passive. It was active, like the fertile soil before seeds are planted. It was the state from which creation itself emerged. And when you enter it, truly enter it, the body stops fidgeting, the mind stops running, and something else begins to move. That movement is the Merkaba's awakening. Not in the sense of a sudden explosion of light, but like a star you've been carrying within you all along. A star that only needed you to stop long enough for it to remember it can shine. The first civilizations to speak of the Merkaba did so with reverence, because they understood something we are only beginning to rediscover. This is not imagination. This is technology, a technology of consciousness. The Merkaba was more than a word. It was a blueprint, a design written into the human form, mirroring the same laws that shape galaxies and atoms alike. They knew that light was not just illumination, it was structure. Spirit was not just belief, it was motion. And the body was not just a shell, it was the anchor that made the journey possible. To awaken the Merkaba was to awaken the vehicle that could carry you beyond the illusion that you are separate from the whole. But here's the paradox. The Merkaba's first door is not reached by going somewhere. It is reached by staying. Staying in the body until the mind quiets. Staying in the breath until it feels infinite. Staying in the moment until the boundaries dissolve. That is why the journey begins here, before the histories, before the diagrams, before the rituals. Because without stillness, everything else is just noise. The body is still. The mind is silent. The soul begins to move. That's where the first door stands. And if you step through, nothing will ever feel separate again. Origins and hidden histories. Every journey has an origin, but some origins are so old, so far beneath the layers of recorded history, that they no longer look like beginnings at all. They look like myths. They feel like dreams. And yet, they remain. When we speak of the Merkaba today, we inherit fragments, a syllable from Egypt, a diagram from Kabbalah, a whisper from mystics in the East. Each piece is like a shard of the mirror, reflecting the same light from a different angle. But once, these pieces belonged to a whole. Long before the Great Pyramids rose above the Nile, there was an understanding, not just of stone and chisel, but of the very fabric of existence. This understanding was not held in books. It was carried in the bodies and minds of those who lived it. They were the astronomer priests of Heliopolis, the keepers of the star temples in Abydos, and further back still, the unknown architects of a forgotten age. They spoke of Mer as the field of living light, of Ka as the spark of the Creator moving through each being, and of Ba as the traveler, the form the spark would take when journeying beyond the flesh. These were not poetic metaphors. They were maps. Maps not of rivers or kingdoms, but of the pathways between worlds. To find the Merkaba in history, you cannot look only at Egypt. You have to follow the currents, trails of symbols that leap continents and centuries. The six-pointed star in Mesopotamian seals, the chariot of fire in Hebrew scripture, the rotating wheel of light in Buddhist mandalas. Each culture used its own language, its own sacred geometry, but they were sketching the same thing. It is said that in the temples of Saqqara, initiates would train in darkness for 40 days, until their senses no longer clung to the physical world. When the body was still, when the mind was silent, a new perception would awaken. And here, as in part 1, the old words return. When the body is still and the mind is silent, the soul activates its light vehicle, the Merkaba, and journeys beyond the illusion of separation, by Dr. Drunvalo Melchizedek. This was not an abstract idea to them. It was a literal threshold they could cross. But history, as we know it, has a habit of erasing what it does not understand. When empires fall, the first casualties are the libraries, and the second are the living carriers of memory. The Egyptian priesthood scattered, their knowledge absorbed into the Hellenistic schools, translated, mistranslated, and finally, buried. In medieval Europe, whispers of the Merkaba survived in Jewish mysticism, where it became the Merkava, the divine chariot seen by the prophet Ezekiel. In these visions, the chariot was not a vehicle of wood or metal, but a structure of spinning light, guided by beings of impossible form. And if you look closer, you see the same architecture. Tetrahedrons, wheels within wheels, the same geometry that the Nile priests said could carry the soul. The further you travel back, the more the trail blurs between archaeology and myth. The Dogon of Mali speak of a star system no one could see until modern telescopes. The Hopi tell of the ant people who sheltered humanity in underground chambers during the world's destruction. In India's Vedic hymns, the gods move in vimanas, radiant vehicles shaped not unlike the interlocking forms of the Merkaba. Are these coincidences, or are they fragments of a memory older than any single culture? The hidden histories of the Merkaba are this. It is not the property of any one people. It is a pattern that emerges whenever humans reach a certain depth of stillness and a certain height of awareness. It appears in dreams, in visions, in the geometry of sacred architecture. It is rediscovered, forgotten, and rediscovered again, because it is woven into the architecture of consciousness itself. Some scholars argue that the Merkaba was always symbolic, a poetic device to speak of enlightenment. But the initiates knew better. They spoke of it as a vehicle, one that could be activated, directed, and used to travel beyond the boundaries of the physical. Not in the sense of a spaceship, but in the sense of shifting your point of awareness entirely, from here to anywhere. Every civilization that has touched the Merkaba has also used it to build something in the physical world, a mirror of the heavens. The Great Pyramid is not just a tomb. Borobudur in Indonesia is not just a temple. These are maps of the invisible made visible in stone. Standing inside them is like standing inside the Merkaba itself, a resonant chamber designed to tune your body, quiet your mind, and ignite the light vehicle within. The origins of the Merkaba are not in Egypt. They are not in any one temple or text. They are in the first human who sat in stillness, who listened so deeply that the silence began to sing. From that moment on, humanity has been following the same melody, sometimes faint, sometimes lost, but always there. The hidden histories tell us one thing. The first door was only the beginning. What comes next is the architecture of the universe itself. The geometry of creation. Before there was life, Before there was form, there was geometry. Not lines drawn on paper, but living patterns, vibrating fields of possibility. And from those patterns came everything. The ancients didn't see creation as an explosion. They saw it as an unfolding, like a flower opening petal by petal, each shape giving rise to the next, each proportion whispering the instructions for the world that would follow. This is the flower of life, a pattern found in temples from Egypt to China, from the ruins of Abydos to the Forbidden City in Beijing. It's carved into granite blocks, painted on frescoes, woven into cloth, as if every culture that touched it recognized it as something too important to forget. Within this single pattern are the blueprints for all physical forms, the platonic solids that shape molecules, the spirals that guide galaxies, the ratios that make a seashell or a sunflower, or the orbit of Venus. It is not just beautiful, it is functional. It is the geometry of existence itself. In the teachings of the mystery schools, geometry was not a study of math. It was a study of God's handwriting. To draw these shapes was to touch the mind of the Creator. To stand inside them, as in the great cathedrals, the megalithic circles, the pyramids, was to align your own body with the same resonance that called the stars into being. They believed that if you could hold these patterns in your mind with absolute stillness and clarity, you could create in the same way the universe creates. This is where the Merkaba comes back into focus. It is not separate from the flower of life. It is born from it. Two interlocking tetrahedrons, one pointing upward, one downward, emerge naturally from the pattern's proportions. One is the energy of ascent toward the infinite. The other is the energy of descent, bringing the infinite into form. When both are activated and spinning in harmony, they generate a field, a living, rotating star of light, capable of moving consciousness anywhere in creation. Modern science speaks of quantum fields, non-locality, the idea that information can exist everywhere at once. The ancients spoke of the same thing, but they used geometry instead of equations. They said, the universe is made of patterns. If you know the pattern, you know the path. But the geometry of creation is not just cosmic. It is intimate. It is in the rhythm of your breath, the pattern of your heartbeat, the spiral of your DNA. You are not a separate observer of this geometry. You are it. And here, once again, the old wisdom returns, fitting perfectly, as though it was meant to be spoken here. When the body is still and the mind is silent, the soul activates its light vehicle, the Merkaba, and journeys beyond the illusion of separation. Dr. Drunvalo Melchizedek. Because to enter the geometry of creation is to step beyond the illusion entirely. It is to see that the Creator did not just make the world. The Creator left the plans inside you. The ancients knew this. It's why their sacred sites are not random.
Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid, Teotihuacan, all aligned not just to the stars above, but to proportions that mirror the flower of life. These were not merely places of worship. They were instruments built to play the same music the universe plays, to tune human beings to that frequency. This is why, in initiatory traditions, students were not told the meaning of the symbols immediately. They were asked to live with them, to meditate on them, to dream with them. Because the geometry is a language beyond words, and like any language, it speaks differently to each soul. In modern times, we see the flower of life printed on t-shirts or used as a logo, and we think it is decoration. But to the ancients, it was a key. And like any key, it only matters if you know the door it opens. That door is the practice, the way of turning stillness and silence into motion, of aligning the self with the living geometry, until the Merkaba begins to turn. The geometry of creation is not a relic. It is alive, and those who know how to work with it are not bound by the limits of space or time or the body itself. Which is why the next step is learning how to activate it.
The practice of activation. It's one thing to understand the geometry, it's another to make it move. In the mystery schools, this was the threshold that separated the student from the initiate. Not everyone crossed it, and those who did were never the same. Activation was never a ritual of the hands. It was a ritual of the self. The ancients taught that the body, the mind, and the spirit had to be brought into perfect harmony, still enough to hear the subtle currents beneath thought, clear enough to hold an image until it became reality. They began with the body, because a body intention cannot hold the charge of the Merkaba. Movements were slow, sometimes imperceptible, designed to release the muscles, to open the breath, to let the bones remember they were part of something larger. It was not about flexibility, it was about conductivity. The body had to become a vessel without blockages, a temple prepared for light. Next came the mind. Here, the training was even more difficult because the mind does not like to be still. It clings to noise, to memory, to the constant hum of identity. The initiate was taught to sit in complete silence, not suppressing thoughts, but letting them dissolve on their own, until even the idea of I became transparent. And finally, the spirit. This was where the teaching became dangerous, because here the initiate was asked to step beyond the illusion of separation entirely, to feel, not as a belief, but as a direct knowing that they were not a body looking at the stars. They were the stars looking back through a body. And then the words would be given, not as poetry, but as instruction. When the body is still and the mind is silent, the soul activates its light vehicle, the Merkaba, and journeys beyond the illusion of separation. Dr. Drunvalo Melchizedek. These words were not meant to be remembered. They were meant to be lived. The initiate would repeat them inwardly as the breathing began, slow, deliberate inhales, matched with visualizing the two interlocked tetrahedrons turning in opposite directions around their body.
One tetrahedron, pointing upward, was set to spin clockwise. The other, pointing downward, spun counterclockwise. With each breath, the field expanded. First, a few feet, then many meters, until the initiate could no longer sense where their body ended and the light began. The ancients described this moment as riding the chariot. The Merkaba in Hebrew mysticism means chariot of the spirit. It is both vehicle and destination. When it's active, space and time lose their grip. You can be in the temple and in the stars at the same time. You can move across realms, not by distance, but by frequency. This was the heart of activation. Not escape, but connection. The initiate did not use the Merkaba to flee the world. They used it to return with greater clarity, to heal, to guide, to speak with voices that are no longer heard in ordinary reality. And here is where the practice became a lifetime discipline. Because the Merkaba is not a machine you turn on and off. It is a living field. It responds to your state of being. If fear, anger, or dishonesty enter, its rotation slows. If love, truth, and presence fill you, it becomes a radiant force that nothing can penetrate. Those who mastered the practice could carry the field everywhere, into the marketplace, into moments of danger, into the act of creation itself. They became walking embodiments of the geometry of creation. But mastery was never the final goal. The ancients said, to activate the Merkaba is to remember. To live in the Merkaba is to serve. This is the practice of activation. It is the bridge between knowing and becoming. And once it is crossed, the transformation begins. The transformation. Something happens the first time the Merkaba truly spins. It's not an explosion. It's not fireworks. It's silence. A silence so deep it feels like the universe has turned its attention toward you. And in that stillness, you realize the attention was always there. You were just too loud to hear it. The transformation is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming undivided. For years, maybe lifetimes, the self was split into compartments. What you show, what you hide, what you've forgotten. When the Merkaba awakens, the walls dissolve. You meet yourself whole for the first time. In the ancient temples, this was the moment when the teacher would say nothing, because no teaching could match what was already unfolding inside the initiate. The field of light did more than transport. It rewrote the patterns that had kept them bound. Some spoke of feeling as though they were remembering a language they had once spoken fluently, a language of light,
where every color carried meaning and every pattern was a sentence.
The transformation was visible, not just to the initiate, but to anyone who looked into their eyes. The ancients said the gaze of one who has activated the Merkaba could awaken memory in others, as if the light knew how to find its own reflection. But this was also a dangerous moment, because with expanded perception came the temptation to believe you had arrived, and that was the first trap. The Merkaba does not elevate you above others. It roots you deeper into them. The illusion of separation is shattered, and what replaces it is the unbearable truth. Everything you do now affects the whole. The transformation rippled outward. Family members felt calmer in their presence. Strangers opened up without knowing why. Conflict seemed to dissolve more quickly, not because the world had changed, but because the initiate no longer fed it with fear. This is where the ancient saying returns with new weight. When the body is still and the mind is silent, the soul activates its light vehicle, the Merkaba, and journeys beyond the illusion of separation. Dr. Drunvalo Melchizedek. Because now it's no longer a quote you hear, it's the condition you live in. Stillness and silence are no longer practices. They are your default state, and from that state, you begin to act. The ancients describe this stage as the return of the architect. You begin to see the structures, physical and invisible, that shape human life. You see where they are strong, and where they are rotting from within. And without force, you begin to repair them. Not with hammers and stone, but with intention and frequency. But the greatest transformation is inward. The fear of death evaporates, not because you no longer value life, but because you understand it's not a straight line with an end. It's a spiral. You've traveled it before. You'll travel it again. And between each turn of the spiral, there is only more light. This is the transformation the ancients guarded so carefully, because it cannot be given in words. It must be lived into, step by step, breath by breath, until the person who began the journey no longer exists in the same way. From here, the initiate is ready for the final chapter, the one where transformation becomes destiny. Transformation is not a single flash of light that sears away the old and leaves you brand new. It is a slow turning of the soul, like the earth shifting into a new season. You don't wake up one morning as a different person. Instead, you realize that small, quiet changes have been rippling through you for days, weeks, years, until one day you look in the mirror and can no longer find the person you once thought you were. It begins almost unnoticed. A silence within you deepens. The noise, the constant hum of worries, doubts, and restless questions starts to fade. Your breath feels different, not because it has changed, but because you are finally with it, fully, consciously. You start to catch yourself in moments you never used to see. Where once you reacted out of habit, now you pause. Where you once rushed to fill the air with words, you allow space, and in that space, truth emerges. A conversation that would have escalated into conflict becomes an opening for understanding. A challenge that once seemed like a wall now appears as a doorway. And then there is a deeper shift. You begin to feel that you are no longer inside life looking out, but that life itself is inside you. It is here, in this awakening, that the words of Dr. Drunvalo Melchizedek move from theory into lived reality. When the body is still and the mind is silent, the soul activates its light vehicle, the Merkaba, and journeys beyond the illusion of separation. The moment you experience this for yourself, you understand. These are not just poetic phrases. They are coordinates, a map, a way back to a home you didn't even remember you had left. The Merkaba does not carry you away from life. It carries you deeper into it. Your senses sharpen. Colors seem a richer. Sound carries a strange new texture. Touch feels sacred. The mundane reveals its hidden symmetry. The spiral in a seashell. The geometry in a sunflower. The perfect proportion in the curve of a river's bend. And then you realize the same design is in you. The spiral of your DNA, the rhythm of your breath, the pulse of your heartbeat, in time with the turning of distant galaxies. It is not imagination, it is recognition. Transformation through the Merkaba is not about becoming someone else. It's about uncovering the one you already are. The you that was never broken, never incomplete, never separate from the whole. As you live in this light, people begin to notice, though they can't quite name it. They see a calm in your eyes, a weightlessness in your step, a presence that makes them feel safe, even if they don't know why. You are no longer radiating energy from effort or performance. You are simply allowing what is already there to flow, and that is what draws them. In this state, your choices begin to change, not because you force them to, but because they naturally align with a higher rhythm. You choose words that heal instead of wound. You see opportunities where you once saw threats. And you begin to understand that true protection is not building walls, it is radiating a field so coherent, so whole, that nothing discordant can enter. This is what the ancients meant when they called the Merkaba a vehicle of light. It is a shield that does not block, but transforms. A compass that does not point north, but inward. A vessel that travels not through space, but through consciousness. The longer you dwell here, the more you realize that living inside the Merkaba is not a mystical escape, it is a practical revolution. Your relationships shift, your work shifts, your very sense of identity shifts. The things you once chased begin to feel irrelevant. The things you once ignored begin to shine.
And in this living geometry of light, you are reminded of the most essential truth. You are not here to find the divine. You are here to remember it. Remember that you are light. Remember that you are spirit. Remember that you are body. And remember that all three are one. The transformation is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of living it. From this point forward, every step you take, every breath you draw, every heartbeat you feel is carried in the knowing that you are no longer separate. You never were. The Merkaba does not return you to who you were. It returns you to who you have always been. And when you finally live from that place, you see that there is no other side to reach, no higher ground to climb, no finish line to cross. There is only this, the stillness between breaths, where light, spirit, and body remember they are one. And in that remembering, you become the light you were always meant to be.